In 1861, the Italian peninsula was unified under a single political entity for the first time since the fall of Rome. The unification of Italy was overshadowed by the unification of the larger and more developed Germany, but it still had a profound effect on European geopolitics. Suddenly, there was a large, semi-industrialized kingdom with a massive population to draw from, jutting into the central Mediterranean, and bordering both France and Austria-Hungary. Italian policymakers understood that Italy was poor relative to Britain, France, and Germany, but followed a policy of the decisive weight. After the Franco-Prussian War, reconciliation between France and Germany was off the table. Continental Europe was divided into two camps. On one side there was Germany and Austria-Hungary, on the other, France and eventually Russia. Britain was in splendid isolation, so the Italians sought to tip the scales in favor of one of the two alliances for their own benefit. In May of 1882, Italy joined the Triple Alliance. The German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck viewed Italy as a threat to Austria-Hungary in any potential war. By bringing Italy into the alliance, he'd prevent the Italians from tying down vital Austrian manpower and resources in case of war with Russia. Moreover, the Italians would be able to tie down French manpower and resources in the south to give the Germans a decisive edge in northern France. After having taken Alsace-Lorraine from the French in 1871, Bismarck viewed them as the biggest threat to Germany dominating continental Europe, economically and politically. Bismarck had originally tried to bring Russia into an alliance, but it failed because of bad blood between them and the Austrians. His goal was to prevent war in Europe. By maintaining a balance of power, it would allow Germany the peace necessary to achieve economic prosperity. He eschewed acquiring overseas colonies, as he believed that the expansion of Germany in Africa and Asia would weaken German power where it mattered most, in continental Europe. Bismarck was fired by Kaiser Wilhelm, who followed a policy of world politics. His ambitions were to make Germany an imperial power, comparable in size and scope to Britain, France, and Russia. In his efforts to do that, he began the construction of a great fleet that alienated the British and pushed them into the arms of the French and the Russians. They formed the Triple Entente, and so Europe was divided into two armed camps, one spearheaded by Germany, with Austria-Hungary and Italy as allies, the other centered around France, with Russia and Britain as allies. In June 28th of 1914, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by the Serbian ultranationalist, Gavrilo Princip, and the Austrians sent an ultimatum to the Serbian government. The Serbians accepted all of Austria's terms, except for the one that would violate their own sovereignty. Using this as a casus belli, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, but Serbia was allied to Russia, and because of the alliance system, all the major industrial powers of Europe were dragged into the war, except for Italy. The Italian Chief of Staff Alberto Pollio had been a strong triplicist. He was a close friend of both the German Chief of Staff, Moltke the Younger, and the Austrian Chief of Staff, Konrad von Hotzendorf. He also spoke fluent German, had served as the Italian military attaché in Vienna, and was married to an Austrian countess. He died on the 1st of July, 1914, and was replaced by General Luigi Codorno. When the war began, the Italians argued that the Triple Alliance was defensive and declared neutrality. The Italians were wooed by both sides, but decided to join the Entente. A secret agreement between representatives of the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and Italy was concluded on the 26th of April, 1915, that would give the Italians control of Austrian Tyrol, Istria, and Dalmatia, leaving them dominant in the Adriatic Sea. Luigi Codorno was a martinet, dismissive of the country's political authorities and ruthless with his troops. During the course of the war, he fired 217 generals and reportedly brought back the ancient Roman practice of decimation, killing 1/10 of every soldier in a unit. The generals of World War I are often portrayed as indifferent and callous butchers. If that was true of any of them, it was true of General Codorno. Over the course of 1914, he launched 4 offensives on the Isonzo, while trying to take the fortress of Gorizia, and allow the Italian armies to pivot south and move towards Trieste. Many offensives failed. Italian soldiers climbed mountains and hills to face entrenched Austrians, under the command of one of their most capable generals, Svetozar Borojevic, with heavy casualties on both sides. 250,000 soldiers were lost by the Italians before the capture of Gorizia in 1916. In that same year, the Austrians launched an offensive of their own. The Italians called it the Battle of the Plateau, and the Austrians called it the Punitive Expedition. However, like the Isonzo battles, it ground to a halt and left heavy casualties on both sides. Battles were fought on the Isonzo with 1 definitive victory, 6 limited advances, and 4 defeats. World War I was a global conflict, but the bulk of it took place in Europe. The 3 principal fronts descending in importance were the Western Front in northern France and Belgium, the Eastern Front in Prussia, Romania, and Western Russia, and the Italian Front along the Alpine border between Austria-Hungary and Italy. 1917 brought a major change to the war effort. The Bolshevik Revolution happened. Tsar Nicholas was forced to abdicate, and a provisional government was established under the Russian lawyer, Alexander Kerensky. With Russia out of the war, the Italian front became second only to the Western Front in importance. Luigi Codorno continued his offensives on the Isonzo with little success. More than the Western or Eastern Front, the terrain between Austria and Italy was unsuited for a war of maneuver. It was mountainous and the ground was broken, making logistics difficult. A system of pulleys, levers, and zip lines were needed just to get supplies and reinforcements to the front lines, and the cold would freeze weapons solid. However, the Austrians had felt the pain from these offensives. After 11 battles, over 1.5 million soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured on both sides of the Isonzo River. The Austrians called for German assistance, and with the Eastern Front quieting down, they were able to redeploy a German field army to assist their allies. The Austrians and Germans would serve together under the command of General Otto von Bellau. In late 1917, Codorno noticed that the disposition of guns and men favored offensive action, and wanted this corrected without delay. Responsibility for implementing this order lay with his subordinate, General Pietro Badoglio. He'd had success in taking Mount Sabatino in August 1916, and saw a meteoric rise, going from a lieutenant colonel to a general within a year. Especially notable for an Italian officer, as promotions tended to be based on seniority, and Badoglio was only in his 40s. The general inexplicably waited 12 days to relay Codorno's order. Badoglio had also ordered the Corps Artillery commander not to open fire without his authorization. The commander called for permission, but Badoglio refused as they only had 3 days' worth of shells. German artillery knocked out the telephone link between the Corps commander's quarters and his artillery headquarters, so they didn't return fire. The Germans launched a fierce bombardment of Italian guns and fired 2,000 rounds of arsenic, smothering the Italian trenches in a dense cloud of poison gas. German and Austrian stormtrooper units led attacks with light machine guns, trench mortars, mountain guns, flamethrowers, and hand grenades. The Second Army commander, Luigi Capello, was sick with a fever, and asked Codorno for permission to retreat in order to avoid a rout, but Codorno believed the force could hold out and denied the request. The Second Army was routed. Taking no responsibility, Codorno blamed the troops for the defeat, even though their morale had shattered in his repeated and futile bloody offensives. He ordered retreating officers to be shot. A stand was made at Pozzuolo by 2 Italian brigades, and though they were destroyed, it allowed the Italians to regroup on the Piave. The Italians lost almost 300,000 soldiers at Caporetto. Most of them were captured. The Germans and Austrians suffered about 70,000 killed and wounded. The disastrous Battle of Caporetto caused the governmental collapse, and the new prime minister, Vittorio Orlando's first action was to fire Codorno. Armando Diaz replaced him and was charged with organizing the defenses at Mount Grappa and the Piave River. The breakdown in communication allowed more tactical flexibility among smaller units, and the invasion of Italy proper increased investment in the war effort among soldiers and civilians alike. The Germans and Austrians suffered 21,000 casualties trying to make it to Venice. The Italians suffered 12,000. The Germans withdrew from the Italian front, and 2 French and 3 British divisions were sent to shore up the Italians while they set in for winter. The Italians reciprocated by sending an expeditionary corps to the Western Front, under the command of Alberico Albrischi, that would see action at the Marne and in the 100 Days Offensive. Orlando and Diaz set about restoring morale in the army. War pensions were created, soldiers received new life insurance policies to help their families in case of their deaths, and a propaganda service was created to gin up nationalism and increase support for the war effort. Annual paid leave was increased from 15 to 25 days. Diaz softened the harsh discipline practiced by Italian officers and increased rations. Rather than repeatedly bash his armies into Austrian defenses, Diaz chose to fight a defensive war and adopted the defense-in-depth tactics employed on the Western Front. With lightly defended lines towards the front to slow the advance and counterattack while the enemy was weakened. The Austrians were pressed by their German allies into launching another offensive in June of 1918, against the wishes of General Bolshevik. The Austrian force was divided into 2 army groups of 58 divisions. Army Group Tyrol was under the command of General Hotzendorf in the north, and Army Group Piave was under the command of General Bolshevik. Against them were 55 Allied divisions, including 50 Italian divisions, 3 British divisions, and 2 French divisions. The Austrians gathered 5,000 guns against the Italians' 40,500. Hotzendorf began the attack on the 13th of June 1918, but Diaz had gathered intelligence of the enemy plan and opened fire half an hour before the Austrians, killing them as they moved into position for the attack. On the Asiago and Mount Grappa, the British, French, and Italians repulsed their advances. Bolshevik had more success on the Piave. 100,000 Austrians managed to successfully cross the river and established bridgeheads on the western bank. However, Diaz used an elastic defense and absorbed enemy thrusts in deep systems of trenches. Having contained Hotzendorf's offensive, he redeployed his reserves southward to push back the Austrians, and had Italian aircraft strafe retreating Austrians as they fled back across the river under heavy artillery fire. The Italians took 90,000 casualties, the Austrians over 150,000. To compound their defeat on land, an Italian torpedo boat managed to sink the St. Istvan off the coast of Bermuda, the greatest ship in the Austrian fleet. For most of the war, the Italians had balled up the Austro-Hungarian navy in the Adriatic. With defeats at land and sea, it was clear that the war was coming to an end, and the various ethnic and religious minorities of the empire began demanding independence. The final offensive consisted of 1.5 million mostly Italian soldiers against 1.8 million Austrians. The Italians now had a definitive advantage in guns and aircraft. On the anniversary of the Battle of Caporetto, Diaz launched a splintering attack on Mount Grappa and the Piave River. The demoralized and fatigued Austro-Hungarian army was routed at the cost of 40,000 Allied troops, including 2,139 British and 778 French. The Austrians suffered 30,000 deaths, 50,000 wounded, and almost 500,000 soldiers were captured, along with 2,000 artillery pieces. The empire sued for peace, and the Italian army marched into Austria-Hungary as the empire collapsed. The Italian front is often neglected or treated as an afterthought, but it was of great significance to the overall war effort for the Entente. From its beginning to the surrender of Russia, it was the third most important front and tied up significant amount of men and resources. After Russia surrendered, it was second only to the war in the West. In under 4 years of fighting, 651,000 Italians were killed, 954,000 were wounded, and 530,000 were taken prisoner. The Austro-Hungarians suffered 576,000 deaths, 1,210,000 wounded, and over 500,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. To put this in perspective, in almost 5 years of fighting, the Ottoman Empire managed to mobilize a high estimate of 2.8 million soldiers. Austrian casualties on the Italian front, as the low estimate, numbered over 2,330,000 soldiers in under 4 years of fighting. Moreover, the Austro-Hungarian fleet could have been a thorn in the side of the French and British navies, but remained balled up in the Adriatic by the Italians at the Otranto Strait. In such a close war, the Italians acted as a decisive weight, tipping the war in favor of the Entente and against the Central Powers. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Have a nice day.